Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. It's hard these days to find optimism. There are hostage talks, there's the war that continues, and we of course hope and pray that a deal will come soon. But the mere thought that we're more than 9 months into this war, with the casualties, the suffering of the hostages, their families that are waiting for their loved ones, all of it can weigh on you. Which is why I'm happy today to shift gears a bit and talk about something a bit optimistic. I'm joined by Aviva Klompas. We've had Aviva before on the show, and she has really carved out a reputation as a leading educator and engaging author. As co-founder and CEO of Boundless, Aviva is reshaping Israel education and confronting anti-Semitism head-on. Aviva previously served as director of speechwriting for Israel at the United Nations, as well as a senior policy advisor for Syrian refugee resettlement in Canada. I spoke to Aviva to mark the publication of her new book, Stand Up Nation, the story of Israeli resilience in the wake of disaster. It's a great and easy read, Stand Up Nation, and will take you on a journey through, as the book says, the inspiring and often unbelievable stories of Israel's unsung heroes, individuals who are risking their lives to save others and partnering with people around the world to build stronger, healthier, and more prosperous societies. I also spoke to Aviva, one of the great influencers and digital warriors for Israel on social media, to help diagnose what the problem is when it comes to telling Israel's story to the world. Why is it so hard for Israel to get its public diplomacy right? It's one of the more frustrating issues that I think about. And Aviva has some really great insight. Here we go. Aviva, it's great to have you back on the show. Thank you so much for joining us this time, I guess, from Boston with Golda Meir looking over your left shoulder. And it's quite the painting. I like it.
Thank you so much. I am delighted to be back. I love your webinars and I'm thrilled to be a guest. And yes, it's always helpful to have Golda keeping an eye.
Yeah, so usually in my office, I have one of those, the miniature Zionist little...
Mine are right there.
I see them. Yeah. So I also have the
Yeah.
Golda one as well, but a
Yeah.
little smaller in size. Anyhow, we are here. I mean, I'm a big fan of your social media activity. I've long said, I think I said in the last time that we spoke, people should be following you because you're really going to get some of the great, really emotional, important, moving stories of what's happening in Israel, and as well as calling out with wit and sophistication when there's some of the craziness that we're all facing in the world. So maybe we'll talk a bit about that. But the reason that we're here is because, congratulations, you have a new book, Stand Up Nation, Israeli Resilience in the Wake of Disaster. And we'll put a link, obviously, to the book in the notes. But I love the cover, Star of David with a little kind of sapling of a something
sapling.
growing, which really is... Right. There you go. It's very powerful, the image. And it's an interesting time to come out with a book, I think, about hope and about positivity and optimism. So walk us through, if you can, what's the book about and what is it trying to achieve?
So it is an interesting time to be putting out a book, but the truth of the matter is I've been working on this book since 2020. It's been 4 years in the making, but the origin story is actually 10 years old. So 10 years ago, I was working as the speechwriter for Israel at the United Nations. And when you're the speechwriter for Israel at the UN, it's one person with one job for all English language communications. And in addition to the speeches, I mean, it's op-eds, it's social media, and just the range of topics that the UN covers is enormously broad. We tend to hear about the security elements of it, but it's so much more than that. And I often didn't have a lot of time to research because the quantity was just coming at me so fast. But when there were speeches about international development, and I was doing that research, I just fell down a rabbit hole, reading about all the things that I love. So Israel's earliest days, the pioneering spirit, the transformation of Israel into the startup nation, the audacity of Israelis to imagine that the world can be different, and of course, stories about Golda Meir. And I discovered this entire history of Israel that I feel is largely untold. After I left the UN, I was running study tours for young Jewish professionals to developing countries with the sole purpose of showing them what Israel is doing in developing in low-income countries. And we traveled to Uganda and Kenya, Guatemala, Nepal, India, all sorts of places. And then in 2020, I was supposed to take a trip to Tanzania, and COVID put a halt to it. So instead of going in person, I had to travel vicariously in my mind. And that's when I started to write the book. I started to write down the story that I had been so passionate about sharing for so long. And what this book really covers is this phenomenal story about how Israel, when it was a developing country, it was desperately poor in its first 10 years. It was struggling not only with wars of survival, but it had no economic partners. It was diplomatically and politically isolated in the world. It had this enormous influx of refugees. Israel's population doubled in its first 2 years and then tripled 7 years later. I mean, that rate of population growth would cripple any country. And these are refugees who need everything, shelter, food, education, language, job training, etc. And Israel is on the brink of economic collapse constantly. In that environment, in that context, it founds an international development agency. It is an unbelievable story of audacity. The driving forces are David Ben-Gurion and Golda Meir. I explain how it happens in the book. Israel has an international development agency before the United States, before Canada, before England, before the UN has UNDP, its development program. And that's right, Israel's international development program is called Mashav. And then what I do is I come to the present day and I profile some extraordinary Israelis who are the founders and leaders of extraordinary NGOs that are doing this work in the developing world in agriculture, solar, healthcare, all sorts of different things. And I tell their stories. And what I love so much about this book, particularly in this very dark and difficult time, is that it's a window into the Israel that I know. It's a window into the Israeli people that I see and experience. And I would love for people to step away from the headlines and from social media where there is one portrayal of Israel and see the real Israel. And that's the people in this book.
So, I mean, I want to talk about how there's like this kind of dichotomy or these two different Israels. And you just mentioned it, you know, the Israel that you're tweeting about and trying to break up these myths and lies that are spread about Israel around the world by our detractors. And then there is this Israel, which you're saying is the real Israel. So we'll get to that in a moment, but I want to just stay on the book for 1 second. I like the way you split up so when you get into the different NGOs and the different activities that are being done, I like how you kind of split them up into different activities. So or categories. You have the chutzpahism, idealism, pragmatism, adventurism, and that's it. So explain to me how you came up. I mean, to me, it's almost everything's chutzpah, though. I mean, like, you know, that's the Israeli DNA. It's that gene that we can do anything that we want, right? Nothing can stop Israel to some extent.
Absolutely. So, Yaakov, just on a technical note, your mic cut.
Oh, it did.
So I don't know if we need to redo that last part or if we're still okay on recording.
I'm going to ask the question again.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. There, you're back.
Okay. What was I saying? Oh,
I'm gonna look surprised though.
So I want to get with you and I want to talk about the two different Israels that you just kind of mentioned, the Israel that you're fighting on Twitter and trying to blast and break up the lies that are spread about Israel, because that's the Israel that sadly a lot of the world is seeing right now. But then this Israel that you're trying to portray or showcase to them. But before we do that, I want to talk just a bit more about the book. And I'd like the categories that you split up the different NGOs into. There's the chutzpahism, the idealism, pragmatism, and adventurism. So explain to me was it just the NGOs that you came across and you said, okay, let me see how I set them up? Or did you feel that these 4 categories to some extent actually make up a stronger DNA or like a bigger story about the state of Israel?
So I've been thinking about these people and this question for really a decade now, which is why is Israel so involved outside of its borders? It's certainly not winning any PR points for it. It's not gaining economic benefit. It is not winning votes in the United Nations. And that was sort of one of the early questions that led me to write the book. And I was interviewing, I'd known many of these people for years, and I was interviewing them and I was thinking about their stories and thinking about a structure for the book. And here I have to thank Olam and Diana Ginsburg and Yael Shapira, who gave me so much assistance in writing this book and being a part of the journey in many, many ways. And in conversations, really, as I was thinking about that question of why, it really came down to 4 answers. And they are idealism, that's the tikkun olam, the driver of Jewish values, the pragmatism, which is the simple reality that so many people are looking for ways to uplift themselves, their families, their communities, their societies, their countries, and this work enables them to do so. Adventurism, which, as we know, so many Israelis after their time in the army will go traveling, go on their big trip. They're on the Hummus Trail, or they're in Southeast Asia or Latin America, and they happen upon something and it inspires them to found one of these organizations. And then you have the absolute audacity of a small group of people who have decided that they're going to do this work in countries where there's no political or diplomatic ties with Israel, where if they were to be found out, it would be a death sentence, and where the recipients of aid will never even know it was Israelis helping them because they could be branded as collaborators and it would endanger their lives as well.
You give the example of Israel and Afghanistan. Can you elaborate a bit on what happened there?
Absolutely. So we recall that when the United States withdrew from Afghanistan, there was chaos, and there were a lot of people that were trapped on the wrong side of this conflict, endangered by the Taliban who were returning to power. So this includes judges, members of the media, human rights organizations, women's groups like the robotic team, the cycling team, and so forth. And they were reaching out constantly asking for help. And a lot of people called Yotam, who's the head of Israel Aid, a phenomenal organization, and Yotam is a good friend. And he tells a story where at first he says, I couldn't help them. We had never operated behind enemy lines or in another country. We didn't have relationships. We didn't have infrastructure. We didn't have a way to do that like we have in the countries where they have experience working. And ultimately, through a series of phone calls in a very Israeli networked way, the pieces kind of fell into place. And a plan was sort of dropped into place for him that said, maybe it would be possible, maybe we could save a few. And he kind of connects the dots for different diplomatic contacts, people in the sports world, and they're able to pull off what is really an amazingly audacious rescue to bring people. And the story is incredible. I mean, the people they're trying to rescue have to be collected. They're getting stopped at Taliban checkpoints. Some don't have passports. So then they have to figure out, how are we going to smuggle passports into Afghanistan? How are we going to get them to the people so we can get the people out? It's an amazing story.
So I'll put you on the spot for a moment, Aviva. And out of all these amazing stories, and a lot of these, I think a lot of the NGOs, people who are regular, let's say, Israel watchers or who know Israel would be familiar with, whether it's Innovation Africa, Save a Child's Heart, the Arava Institute, which is really doing some fantastic work now. I mean, there's so many. Each one is really an amazing story in of itself. But if you had to put yourself on one story that really moved you here, what would it be?
That is a very difficult question. I try not to.
No one
to
said
show
this was going to be easy. Come on.
I was going to not show favoritism. I think the one at the beginning of each chapter, where I profile these different NGOs and their founders, I provide a quote from each one of them. And the quote that stands out to me from all the people belongs to Gal Lutzky, who is the founder of Israeli Flying Aid. It's another outstanding organization that operates behind enemy lines. They don't get the type of publicity and media like Israel Aid because they only operate in countries where there's no diplomatic or political relationships. Very often it's Arabs who served in the IDF who are doing this work because they're able to blend into the countries in which they are going. It is truly the most audacious, most life-threatening of work, and she has been in some hairy situations. And their motto, and this is why I'm plucking this one out in particular, says no one asks permission to kill, and so we're not going to ask permission to save lives.
Wow.
The other thing that Gull said that also, 2 quotes stand out in my mind from her, is she said to me, sometimes people ask me, who's your boss? Is it the Mossad? Is it the Israeli government? And the answer to that is neither. And she says, my boss is my conscience.
That is definitely quite the story. So let's shift gears for a moment. And I really recommend, I have yet to read the entire book, but I did read some of the first few chapters, and then I skipped all the way to the end to read the conclusion, because that was a way to kind of get my handle on where the book's going. But how come the world doesn't know this? How come the world doesn't appreciate this? I almost want to, like, to me, in some extent, like kind of the world that I live in, of very much military writing and thinking is
Yeah.
like, I look at it to the extent of, this war that's being prosecuted in Gaza. Like I always say, okay, fine. There's no reason at all in the world that I should accept the casualty death toll that the Hamas health ministry puts out. But let's say I'll accept it. All I ask in return is accept the IDF number. And then you have an unprecedented combatant civilian ratio that's never been seen before in any conflict anywhere, anytime in history, anywhere in the world. Like literally people should be lining the streets applauding standing ovations for the Israeli Defense Forces. But I'm saying that sarcastic because we know no one ever will, except for Israelis and supporters of Israel around the world. But like, people don't want to hear that story and they don't want to hear your story. So why is that? Why are people so quick to turn a blind eye to something that is so real and obvious?
So there's, I think, a lot of elements to that. So first of all, a lot of the conversation, a lot of the place where people are getting their information is social media. Social media algorithms are biased for what engages. Nice stories don't do well. They don't get a lot of engagement or traction, and sort of the bombastic things, they tend to track. And so that you're more likely to see them. You're more likely to have people engaging with them with high emotions. And that's one of the things that we need to navigate in this war. For me, though, and somebody who is like deeply romantically, passionately in love with Israel and Zionism, then I can distinguish that Israel is not a sequence of wars. Israel is not what happened on October 7th. The Jewish people is not an outcome of the Holocaust. These are things that are a part of our story, but they're not defining our story. And for me, when I think about Israel and the Jewish people, I think one of the things that makes us distinct and magnificent is the fact that we have always understood that we are the authors of our story. It's our story to tell, and we're not going to be defined by anybody else. And that's why I wanted to share this book, because this book is really the Israel that I know. It's the people that I know, and it's what I wish people could see.
Do you think, though, that there's people who are receptive, people who don't, let's say, know, people who are not as familiar with Israel? Do you feel, the book, yes, did just come out just over a week ago, but do you feel that there is an audience that is beyond, let's say, the confines of people like us, ourselves, right, who want to hear those good stories, people who just don't know that middle of the crowd in that audience who they don't know, do they hate Israel? Do they like Israel? They've heard bad stuff. They've heard good stuff. They're searching for themselves. Is
Yeah.
that the target here?
I think so. I mean, so first of all, I think we have to distinguish between inside and outside the Jewish world. From the work that I'm doing at Boundless, which is the nonprofit that I co-founded with Dr. Rachel Fish, we know that within the Jewish world, that Israel has always been and continues to be a difficult point of conversation. And so for some people, this is a different foothold into talking about and thinking about Israel. And it's an insight, as I said, into who these people are as the character of a nation. Outside of the Jewish world, I wish I could get this book into the hands of everybody. And that's, I think, the challenge. Again, from Boundless, we know that before the war, about half of the American population actually had no real opinion about Jews. They were very open. Now, the war has changed that quite dramatically. And this is probably the hardest time in the world to convince somebody to read a story that's not actually about the situation in Gaza or about the war, the crisis, the hostages, and so forth. But this is not going to be our forever. As I said, we're the authors of our story. And to my mind, this is a contribution in my way to the Zionist project, and it's building to something larger.
It kind of reminds me to some extent how there's the famous happiness index that comes out.
Yes,
And
the one nice thing the UN gives us. Yes.
the one nice thing. And like, even after October 7, when the last report came out this year in 2024, Israel's ranked 5. I think the year before it was ranked like 4 or 3 or whatever it was. And it's like, how does this make sense? How is a country and a people who are embroiled and engulfed in conflict, surrounded on the famous now 7 fronts that Israel is fighting, whether it's rockets that are sadly, tragically killing people like yesterday, like a few days ago, in the Golan Heights, a couple, parents of 3 children. And of course, the fighting that continues in the Gaza Strip, the hostages who are still being held there. how do you, like, as somebody you've written extensively about Israel, worked with the Israeli government, how do you explain that? I mean, a country that on the one hand, and like you told us that story about Mashav and Golda Meir, and you bring the famous story that Joe Biden likes to quote often towards the end of his book, when he met with Golda Meir back in the 1970s and asked her, what's the secret? And she said that we have nowhere else to go. But
Choice.
what is it about Israel, in your view, Aviva, that on the one hand, a country fighting all the time, but still happy and still saying, you know what, I got my issues, but I want to help people outside. I want to do Innovation Africa. I want to do Israel Aid. I want to help. I want to do Tevel B'Tzedek. These are some of the names of the NGOs that are profiled. Where does that come from?
So the first thing is, I think it's social cohesion. I think Israelis make the best friends, and I'm sorry to my American friends, but I think that happens to be the case. I think Israelis prioritize family. I think they prioritize friends, and that social cohesion, I believe, does a couple of things. First of all, I think it lends itself to a happier society when people are less isolated than you have in the Western context, in North America and in Europe. You have a more robust family life. Everything revolves around the family or Shabbat dinner. In Israel, and I think that's a big component of it. I also think that lends itself to chutzpah, to the audacity and grit that Israelis have, is because you don't feel so alone. Did you ever hear an Israeli entrepreneur tell you a story where they went at it alone? No, the story is like, I called my friend this, I called my friend that. We had 2 degrees of separation to get to this person. It's a whole story about people coming together. And I think that's really what lends itself both to making Israel a happier country than most countries in the world, and their ability to persevere, because it's not for themselves, it's for everybody that's coming together to do it.
Okay, so I want to shift gears and talk about for a moment the war that you're fighting online. You're one of the big influencers of people who are influencing this state of mind.
I don't know what it means. You don't know what it means.
I don't know what it means. People who are influencing other people. But
I don't know about that. I post a lot.
You post a lot, but
Yes.
I think you're up there with the good ones. Anyhow, have you seen a shift? I'm always thinking about, what can be done better? How can we do things? Obviously, I have plenty to say about the Israeli government and its failures to get its act together, and we just keep on shooting ourselves in the head, foot, back, whatever you want to call it, multiple times a day. But I'm wondering, like, at the end, is it a numbers game? Do you think, like, if you have to put your finger on what's the greatest challenge, is it just we're outnumbered? We don't have a good story to tell. We're not savvy. Where is it that we can't get this message across? Not about your book now, but about the fact that we're right. We're just, we're fighting a war that is completely justified and legitimate. And we're doing something that any country in the world would do. Why is it harder for us?
So first, let me agree with you that the Israeli people deserve the very best in their leadership, in the people that keep them secure and safe. And they don't have that right now. And that's it's a tragedy more than it's even a disappointment for it. In terms of the narrative war that's taking place, there's a lot that's working against us. We're a people of 15 million in a world of 8 billion. So there's a numbers component. And they tell me that the 15 million don't always share the same opinion. But even if we did, all 15 million have the same opinion and the same story to tell, we're up against 8 billion. That's part of it. But then really, when you're looking at social media, which really is the #1 medium where most people are getting their information, it's that or their family and friends, which is just another way of saying a different echo chamber. You have the online echo chamber, and then you have your real world echo chamber, where you're engaging with people that think alike and have similar outlooks to you. So on social media, first of all, we know Sayabra, a fantastic Israeli company, tells us that 26% of the conversation about this war between Israel and Hamas is inauthentic, meaning it's bots. There is a 1 in 4 chance that you are in a vitriolic argument with a robot. So maybe we can back our way out of that. The second thing is that we know that there's echo chambers. Social media is built in order to maximize engagement. It's a profit system. You maximize engagement by, as I said, if it enrages and engages, you get the highest engagement with people who absolutely adamantly agree with you or adamantly disagree with you. So if you adamantly agree with me, there's no mind to change. And if you disagree with me, and 1 in 4 you're a bot, there's no mind to change. So the algorithms are pushing us to the polars. Second, you have algorithmic manipulation. We've seen studies, for example, from TikTok that tell us that this Chinese-owned company is suppressing certain information about China, about the Uyghurs, about the South China Sea, about Dalai Lama, about, a lot, about Tibet. And then we also see that they're amplifying certain content that makes the United States look bad. So there's definitely geopolitical interests at play. And then you have foreign intervention. You saw it after October 7th. You saw it after the Iranian ballistic missile and drone attack. There are very, very clear disinformation campaigns that are taking place. The World Economic Forum every year puts out a report in January where they cite the greatest threats to the world in the short term and the long term. It came out in January, and for the first time in the history of the report, the number one threat to the global order in the short term in the next 2 years is disinformation and misinformation campaigns. And you have about half of the adult global population going to elections this year, right? You have the US, France, United Kingdom, Iran. They're not all free and fair elections, but you have a lot of people going, and you have a lot of foreign actors knowing that there's a lot at stake. And that's what's driving some of these disinformation campaigns as well. We have to understand that entire context of what's going on because it is not a fair fight. But the thing is, once we can understand it, research it, and understand those barriers, there's never a doubt in my mind that we can outthink the other side.
So if we understand the context and we understand kind of the rules of engagement and how the sandbox works, then what can we do? We could just fight back more effectively, more strategically?
We need to have better systems. So first of all, we are very often doing the slow process of creating content, or we're doing the slow process of polling and message testing. And we could be using AI to do this more rapidly in A/B testing. We could be using AI to be writing scripts for us that are more targeted to specific audiences. We're not doing enough segmentation. You need to speak differently to different groups. Boundless does a lot of research on different audiences in the United States, priority audiences, and their understanding and knowledge about Israel, about Jews, about Jew hatred, about Zionism. And you have to really hone in on different groups to know what they know, where they get their news and information, who are the credible sources before you can go and develop messages. And then they have to be very, very specific and tailored in order to those audiences. We could be automating some of these things to make it less expensive and more rapid. And we should be more collaborative than we are right now to be sharing information so that we have a feedback loop. We have to change where the priorities are. Right now, very often the emphasis is placed on engagement. So that's views and impressions. How many eyeballs on this or how many comments makes us feel good, makes us feel popular. But when you think about it, it doesn't tell us anything about what I care about. That high impression count, high engagement count comes from interacting with people that either agree with me or disagree so much they'll never change their mind. So again, what's the point? What I should be caring about is knowledge, attitudes, and behavior. I can't see that off superficial metrics on social media. So we need to devise ways, and there are ways to do this where we can better measure that. And that's really what we should be rewarding as an ecosystem, the ability to shift perceptions, to move outside of the echo chamber and interact with people who actually can be persuaded and educated.
I'm tempted to ask, but I knew we're running out of time, but I do want to ask you. So the Israeli government, obviously, I mean, we're just a mess here, right? We have people who say nuke Gaza, resettle Gaza, don't talk about what we want to happen in Gaza. So there's terrible messaging. It's all just all over the place, right? We have no discipline within our government. Everyone can say whatever they want. We don't have really an official spokesmanship or spokesperson system. The IDF is constantly being the one that's going in front of the cameras. So we're very militaristic in the way that we appear to the outside world, even on issues that the military has no really role or no advantage to a civilian or somebody who looks more disarming. If you had to put your finger on the main problem that the state of Israel has, the government, from a governmental perspective, and I ask you because you've just spent a lot of time doing this and working a lot with these people and thinking about this, where would you put it? What would your diagnosis be?
You could ask this question not just about public diplomacy, but so much of what's happening in terms of the politics and diplomacy of Israel. And I think it comes back to what I said before, which is the Israeli people deserve so much better. They deserve leaders who are prioritizing the state and the people, and I don't think that's the case right now. I think we have a set of characters that are acting more out of personal or political interests rather than national interests. And it's deeply unfortunate for all the reasons that you outlined.
Which I totally accept, but I do think that the public diplomacy challenges have long been there even before this terrible government that we have.
For sure. But I think it's for the same reason, is that it's always been he, and not because Golda Meir didn't have this problem. He who controls the narrative and is holding the levers of public diplomacy and media gets to control the story. And that's always going to be a story slanted in their own favor.
And it's slanted by their politics also, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. Or their legal challenges or whatever economic desires they have. Yes, by all sorts of things that are not necessarily in the national interest.
Right. Which is just so disturbing. But I don't want to end with disturbing. I want to end with hope. And that is the book that you all should be getting by Aviva, Stand Up Israel, which is the story of Israeli resilience. Really a fantastic read and needed. I'm sorry, Stand Up Nation, and really needed today in this time of just great concern for Israel, of what's coming in the future. Stand Up Nation is a book that can give you some hope and look for what it is that really is the Jewish and the Israeli story that makes us this really remarkable country. So Aviva, thank you so much for writing it, and thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us on today's episode. You can find us every Monday and Thursday for another episode of the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. Find us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, as well as on the website of the Times of Israel. In the meantime, have a great rest of your week, and we will see you in a few days.